Welcome everyone to the plenary session for Lutyens. We ask that you keep yourself on mute, and if you have a question, please type it in the chat and we'll call on you during the Q&A to ask it. I think everyone's in. So Rosara, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Welcome, everyone. I'm Rosaura Lopez. I'm the Architecture Program Director here in the Universidad de Monterrey, your host for this great event. And I'm so happy to introduce Marcus Lutyens. He has been with us also here in the campus in Sarajevo, I think like 3 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, before COVID, and we have with him a really special workshop, and maybe he will share more of his experience with this talk. And he also participated in the U-Design, that is one of the most important events that we have here in Universidad de Monterrey, especially in our areas, art, architecture, and design. And if you may allow me, I will try to read really fast so you can have more time with Marcus and all that he has to share with us. And I will be reading right now his video. So Lutyens' artistic practice at the intersection of art, architecture, social and ecological interactions targets the physical and emotional well-being of his audiences that affect the deepest levels of their psyche. His works take form in installations, sculptures, drawings, short films, writings, and performances. In his explorations of consciousness, Lutyens has collaborated with celebrated neuroscientists V. Ramachandran and Richard Saitowek, as much as studying under shamans from different cultures. From these investigations and research, he has worked with visitors on consciousness, stays in museums, galleries, and biennales around the world. Lutyens was invited by the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York to be keynote artist with the opening performance at Culture Summit 2019. Lutyens has exhibited in many museums and leading art exhibitions around the world, including the Royal Academy of Arts, the Centre Pompidou, National Art Museum of China, Documenta, and the Biennales of Venice, Istanbul, Liverpool, Sao Paulo. In the time of COVID-19, Lutyens created a series of 12 Zoom performances to help the healing process of people in various countries around the world, and is currently working on the national scale COVID-19 artwork Rose River Memorial, which has been exhibited at various sites around the US, including most recently the Orange County Museum of Art. Lutyens has exhibited internationally in numerous museums, galleries, and biennales, including the Havana Biennale 2019, and as a keynote artist invited by the Guggenheim at Culture Summit Abu Dhabi 2019, the Fear Museum in Seattle, the Miró Foundation in Barcelona, the May Museum in Los Angeles, Latvian National Museum of Art, the 33rd Biennale from Sao Paulo, the Guggenheim Museum in New York, the Armory in New York, Bogosian Foundation in Brussels, the Palazzo Fortuny in Venice, La Monnaie de Paris, Palazzo Grassi in Venice, the 57th and 55th International Art Exhibition of La Biennale di Venezia, and a few more, and a lot of more places around the globe, basically. So with nothing more, Marcus, thank you again for accepting our invite, and hopefully we can learn a lot more from you and for all that you have been experienced this few years ago. Thank you. Welcome all.
Thank you so much, Rosaura, for your wonderful introduction. And I'm very happy to be here today. And thank you for joining us. I'm going to share some slides relating to my work. I come from the field of art, but I'm linked quite a lot to architecture, partly my family roots. I have a great uncle who was a famous British architect who, among other things, designed New Delhi and made 850 projects in different parts of the world, Sir Edwin Lutyens. So I kind of grew up with the kind of, I suppose, architecture DNA, but I was drawn to more kind of experimental fields, and that's why I kind of was rooted in a practice of art, but it does have many intersections with architecture. So without more ado, what I wanted to do was share a slideshow and just talk through my kind of creative process. And whether you're from the academic field or the architectural field or other fields, hopefully there's some things that will be able to mesh with your interests and kind of have an interesting takeaway that you may be able to kind of put in your practice in some way. So hopefully you're seeing the screen. Can you see the screen, Rosaura?
Yes.
Good. Very perfect. Okay. So the title of my presentation is called Sensibility in Space. And it's come to my attention through working with architecture students that often the aspect of sensibility is kind of quite disregarded. And hi, Daniela. So it's quite disregarded. Often in architecture circuits, architects are kind of encouraged to build something, but they're not really encouraged to think about, you know, how that space is inhabited over time, and which seems a bit of a, you know, an oversight. So I wanted to focus more on the idea of, you know, sensibility in all its dimensions in regard to space. So as I was growing up, I went to, you know, I had a pretty standard Western education. I went to a pretty standard Western school, and I went to college in Edinburgh University. But however, I had some experiences that kind of interrupted that kind of predictable flow, let's say, that one might have experienced. And the first one was being with the Auca tribe in Ecuador, where I kind of saw a very different way of going about life that made me think a lot about, you know, the Western world and whether it was right on track. Also, I had some encounters with the Huichol tribe in Mexico, which also kind of made me question a lot about Western values and the Western way of going about things. And also in Peru and in other places, and mostly in the Amazon rainforest, which is such a rich cultural and ecological place. About 2 years ago, I wrote a book called The Quadrant Field, which covered my work in the last 10 years. And it's called The Quadrant Field because I realized that my projects had been focused in 4 different segments. One is internal, which is it's kind of like a meditative space. The second one is, which is represented by the blue rectangle on the right. The second one is sensory, which is the rectangle on the bottom left. The top right one is the social, social interactions, projects with social interactions, and then the top left one is the environmental. So I'm just going to run through a few projects that kind of represent each quadrant, starting with the inductive. I was very interested from working with shamans that I just mentioned in the unconscious and in altered states of reality and altered states of consciousness. And when I kind of emerged from those visits, I found that a way to access these altered states of consciousness is through hypnosis. And so I became a hypnotherapist, and I practiced hypnosis in the context of therapy, but also in the context of art. And these are some examples. For instance, this was Eduction, the Alien Within. It's a project that I worked with Marcus Novak, who's a professor at UC Santa Barbara. And this was way back in 2001, actually. And we were interested in projecting somebody into a virtual reality space in a kind of hypnotic trance to see if there could be like a symbiotic relationship between a kind of machine and the psyche. This is in Oaxaca, which is in the south of Mexico. I worked with a group called the Mushe, who are a third gender group down in Oaxaca. And I worked with them in hypnosis to extract from their minds certain kind of archetypal forms that came from their unconscious. And these I built into a series of what they call castillos, castles, that are pyrotechnic forms that were then kind of exploded in a celebratory way in downtown Oaxaca. This is a kind of, even though I'm kind of classing this to be an inductive quadrant, there's also a kind of architectural component as well and a social component. But anyway, this is a cabin that I designed for Documenta, and it's a very simple looking cabin from the outside. You're kind of led to expect, you know, a small room there that you come into, but when you go in, you realize that there's apparently a mirror on the floor. So the small cabin that you thought you'd anticipate from outside is actually double the, well, it visually looks double the size, but in actual fact, there isn't a mirror there. It's a space that I built downwards into the ground, and down there on the steps, on the bottom steps, I worked with 7,000 people over 100 days in 230 hypnosis performances, exploring sensibility, which is basically the theme of this talk. So anything to do with the senses, with meditative states, with kind of social interactions and how they could be better, and also our relationship to the environment. We worked with Cecil Trolas, who's a very well-known smell scientist and artist who's based in Berlin, and she developed 4 different smells that we deployed there. Smell being something that's, I think, quite overlooked whether in architecture, in other creative practices. Smell is incredibly evocative, and here's a kind of new system that developed, and then you can see me in action. In actual fact, but sometimes I think things appear to be upside down. And based on that, I wrote a book called Memoirs of a Hypnotist, 100 Days, that you may find somewhere online, published by Sternberg Press. I also worked again with this kind of, while I was there in that cabin, I was interested in this idea of kind of a mirrored space. And I actually worked with some twins, acrobatic twins, to develop this project called Twin Apps, where the twins were kind of walking on each other's shoes. One was hanging upside down, the other one was vertical. It's part of this kind of experimentation on how a physical space could be completely different from what you'd expect. I've been interested in the consciousness, not just inside somebody's mind, but inside a lot of people's minds, and how collective consciousness could be experimented with and tracked and shared across different spaces. And this is, project is called K-Tanglement, and it happened in 4 different cities. Bottom right is Toronto. You can see a screen. On the screen, there's a video projection that I made. Also in Amsterdam, bottom left, and there's Milan, and then also actually New York Times Square, which is top left. I also did a project in the Istanbul Biennial where I took over a ship and made, this was the entrance, actually kind of ironic, a little bit like the cabin. You see this kind of modern ship, and then you go actually to enter the ship, you go through this very dilapidated entrance made from old boat parts as a kind of what I call an expectancy violation, which is that you have certain expectations and then these expectations are completely reversed, which kind of allows you to begin to be ready for a kind of different way of looking and thinking about things. And then inside the ship, I found this, I placed this old kind of, the kind of skeleton of an old fishing boat and made, again, hypnosis sessions there, and played as well with Chladni plates, which visualize sound. Another kind of inductive project, this was at the Guggenheim in New York in collaboration with Raimundas Malasauskas, who you can see on the left. He's a very well-known curator, and we did a reading, and then we conducted these hypnosis sessions around the spirals, which I think is the Guggenheim is perfectly suited to kind of hypnosis. Here's in the Fundación Miró, where I was working with bees, and again in an inductive state. I always feel that an inductive state, a hypnotic state, helps connect at a different level of mind. We go about our lives and we think in a conscious way, pretty much, you know, as usual, every day as usual. But I think in order to change the way we do things, I think we need to change the way we think about things. So this is a method. So going on to the next quadrant, the sensory quadrant, I've worked a lot with this theme of synesthesia, which you may or may not have heard of, but the synesthesia is the crossover of the senses that some people have, about, you know, maybe 1 in 20 people have, where sight, like vision, like when you see something, like see a letter, it might have a color, or when you hear a sound, it might have a color. Or for instance, when you hear a sound, it might impact your body in a different way, as a touch feeling. So I've been interested in making a kind of equivalency of these different kind of sensory experiences. And this particular figure is derived from a wheel that psychologist Richard Plutchnik developed in the 1950s and 60s that relates color to emotions. Like, for instance, you can see yellow. From his studies, yellow relates to ecstasy, joy, and serenity, whereas blue relates to grief, sadness, and pensiveness. That these kind of labels could be, you know, up for reinterpretation. For instance, annoyance, anger, and rage correspond to red, but you could also say red is to do with passion. And so what I did here was I collaborated with some smell experts and extended the colors outwards. For instance, red being pepper, cypress, cardamom, and cinnamon, and so on. And then I also collaborated with a musician who works in film design to see what kind of notes or keys actually correspond to these different colors. Kind of work in progress. This is a project I did in San Francisco with some synesthetes. I was kind of horrified actually that that McDonald's had come out with this kind of worldwide, the first worldwide logo, which was "I'm loving it," and the reason why I was horrified, because it was like the first time that some kind of message had gone out across the world in a very homogeneous way. And so what I was interested in doing was sending some synesthetes to this particular McDonald's in San Francisco and seeing what their personal interpretations of McDonald's were. So for instance, the top right, you have McDonald's, which all the letters are different colors. That was Cassidy Curtis. That's his experience. He was there, and for him, the yellow arches that everybody's seen are actually red. And so when he sees the McDonald's, each letter has a different color. Top left is Colleen Silva, who has this very strange and unique type of synesthesia that she sees date lines around her body. So for instance, she would say like, I was at McDonald's in 1971, which is over there. And the last time I was in McDonald's, it was, 2005, which is over here. And then in the future, it kind of goes off somewhere else. And then she has also cost lines, such as, the cost of hamburgers over time. And all these things are placed around her body, as well as days of the week, which are, for her were like a wheel. I mean, this sounds very alien, but these are very normal functioning people, but they just have this kind of extra layer, almost like an augmented reality layer of sensibility around them. And then the bottom left is Lauren Winifay, who could feel all these different sensations on her body, especially sounds. This is work with, this is Vijanu Ramachandran that Rosaura mentioned. He's a very well-known neuroscientist who has worked a lot with the idea of synesthesia and proto-language. And he's drawing on that piece of paper, he's drawing what is known as Kiki Buba, which is, actually I went to see Ramachandran with Daniela a long time ago. And he's drawing on that piece of paper, he's drawing Kiki Buba, which is these two forms that we used to prove a kind of multicultural, transcultural understanding of the relationship between form and sound and language. And you can see the form on the left is kind of curved and rounded, whereas the shape on the right is spiky. And so in this particular test, people were asked around the world which shape corresponds to the sound buba, and which shape corresponds to the sound kiki. And 98% of respondents said that on the right, the star shape corresponded to kiki, one on the left to buba. So I think, even though this is very abstract, I think in terms of, architecture and architectural form, if you're designing a space, you should be thinking about this kind of relationship, when you do a sharp edge, how that relates to ourselves, whether that shape is aggressive to visitors, or whether it's soft, and how there's a kind of a link between emotions, language, and geometry. This was at the Istanbul Biennial that we did this research to do with thought forms, and thought forms were actually a book from 1905 written by Annie Besant, who was a theosophist leader, and her book Thought Forms was credited with starting the abstract art movement in the 20th century. So it was a very important book. And what we were doing was we were experimenting with Ramachandran to see how people responded to these forms from an emotional standpoint. And we did a test, and we charted how people responded to these emotion forms. Interestingly, and perhaps unsurprisingly, women seem to be very much more attuned to the subtleties of forms and shapes in relation to emotions. This is a project I did at South by Southwest in Austin, Texas, and it was to do with memories and emotions. And you can see there's two structures. The one on the left is the interview space, and the one on the right is the public viewing space. So the way this worked was, and it was sponsored by Kodak, and Kodak has a campaign to try to kind of run counter to the Instagram universe that we're in, which is that everybody takes 1 million pictures every 5 seconds, and then you have nothing, 10 years from now, you can't even remember any of your pictures. And what Kodak has been trying to do is kind of heighten the value of special moments. So what we were doing was we were talking to somebody, they'd go into the interview space on the left, and they talk about a particular picture, let's say the last photograph they took with their father in San Francisco. And then I would conduct these interviews, and then meanwhile, people would go into the viewing space on the right, and almost in real time, the impressions from that photograph were projected into the top of the space, which you can see here up top left. You could see the photograph in a kind of kaleidoscopic way, and then it was kind of replicated down inside the space. And in the floor, we had different, we basically changed the color of the floor, we changed the smell of the room, and we did a sound design. There was a team working kind of behind a curtain to kind of generate this. And there was actually a lot of tears were shed, tears of kind of emotional tears of being able to share a very intimate moment with, you know, basically strangers. Which is kind of interesting because often we feel ourselves to be vulnerable in the public space, surrounded by people we don't know. But this kind of showed how there's a lot more empathy in the world around us than we would otherwise imagine. Again, this is working with feelings and emotions. This was a project sponsored by Samsung that I did in different places. This particular one is in Dubai, and I worked with 50 students from Zayed University Madrasa, and we made these kind of umbrellas that would change color depending on visitors' emotions. So depending on how people responded to how you're feeling today, emotionally, then the umbrellas would automatically change color, and then we made a kind of procession. And we also did the same project in Piccadilly Circus, actually on a Friday night rush hour, so it was pretty hectic. But again, bringing emotions down into the public space, making, you know, what would most people would consider to be kind of a vulnerability, where you're kind of signaling your emotional state. That was kind of an interesting exercise. And then I was projecting these videos onto these screens up here, onto this screen as well. There's a filming process and programming process. And we were projecting these videos related to emotions onto these six places: Amsterdam, Singapore, Toronto, New York, Milan, and I think there's one more. Yeah, there's London, which we just saw. But the idea of these was not just a kind of emotional kind of abstraction. The idea was to match to match kind of the emotional state of the city and counterbalance it. And the emotional state of the city, I kind of gauged to be to do with the kind of flows of rush hour and also temperature, weather, basically. And so the faster the rush hour, the slower the visuals would happen. And also the hotter the temperature, the cooler what we were projecting would be, and vice versa. There we are in New York. Actually, that's a climate march. So there's a kind of overlap here between kind of the senses and emotions, and also kind of other concerns such as the environment. This was a project I did in the National Museum in Latvia to do with kind of blind sight, which is kind of seeing with your eyes closed or not being able to see. That structure on the right held 6 drawings that were drawn by blind people. I work a lot with blind people just to see how that lack of sight makes them more sensitive in other areas. So this is a kind of labyrinth experience that people would move through and then get to this center space. There was also some sound design as well. There's one of the drawings, you can actually see these little dots, and they would make the dots, the blind people would make the dots in the paper, and that would give them a sense of where the boundaries would be for their color choices. And the color choices, you may ask, you know, how a blind person who hasn't seen from birth would know what orange is or blue. Basically, they associate, for instance, yellow is associated with the temperature of the sun on their cheeks, or white is associated with cold and snow. So that's how they kind of make a kind of synesthetic relationship. And this is a kind of extension in a way of that project. It's in the Havana Biennial, and it's to do with blind people, kind of teaching people to be more sensitive under their feet. So I made all these different textures for people to walk on, and some of the like the orange texture here, the red texture is a texture that is actually designed for blind people. The other ones are just kind of speculative textures, but that's something to think about if you're working in architecture. Is you know, these kind of aspects that probably most architects don't think about, which is, you know, even if you have shoes on, there's some things going on under your feet in terms of how your feet work on a texture and the textures they feel. And also you'll notice that there's slight ramps here, like obviously steps and level places, but also ramps. And ramps also have a kind of emotional impact. Even a very slight ramp going upwards kind of creates this feeling of kind of perhaps kind of hesitancy, whereas a ramp that's gently sloping downwards gives a sense of kind of positivity or encouragement. Anyway, I don't want to run out of time, so I'll kind of zoom through this sensitivity part. I've worked a lot with autistic people to kind of see how, through experiments to do with sensitivity, with touch, with smell, how we can kind of almost kind of rewire the brain. And worked with different autistic kids and behavioral therapists. This is Elizabeth Freines, who helped with this project. And there you have different, basically a 3D printed form with smell inside. Social, this was a MOCA. I was interested in getting people together. And again, you know, like an architectural space without anyone in it, like Mies van der Rohe in Barcelona, it's usually the photographs are taken completely empty. And, you know, that's something in itself. It's like a kind of sculpture in a way, but architecture is supposed to be kind of lived in. So in this particular case, what I was interested in doing was seeing how relations around a table, what kind of dynamics they make. And so each person had a microphone around their neck, and this kind of, their conversations were traced on this turntable. And what was interesting was to see how when people make a joke, everybody laughs. And that's the only thing that kind of brings people together in conversation. And that was kind of reflected by these servos that would almost like earthquake kind of graphs. So everybody would laugh, and then the conversation would reset, and then somebody would talk, and again, you know, maybe 2 or 3 more people, and then the laugh would create this kind of social kind of earthquake to reset things. And then you can see in action. I was interested in social media, and again, I don't want to run out of time, so I was interested in how people are affected by social media more and more. And I did this project called Social Pharmacon. Pharmacon is a kind of medicine poison. And I think we're in a kind of social media kind of vortex, perhaps some people could say a crisis, where, you know, what's supposed to join us is, in friendship is actually kind of separating us. So that was kind of exploring that. Let's see if I can move on. Yeah. And that kind of led to this project that I did in Beijing, in this complex that was designed by Ai Weiwei. And I did it with the Chambers Fine Art Gallery there. And what I was interested in was seeing the kind of emotional impact of this ringing that you get, often buzzing. And I made this video where every time somebody on the screen was receiving a kind of a text, the chairs that the audience was watching on would buzz as well to kind of create this kind of feedback loop. There's the chamber in which it was happening. And so each time there was a drip, this kind of buzzing would happen as well. So there was, I showed this in the gallery, Chambers Fine Art Gallery as well. These paintings that were rotating slowly. And each time I received a text, from, let's say, Facebook or, you know, Instagram or any other kind of notification, I drip a color-coded drip of paint down, and that will create this kind of map of not just of the notifications, but also kind of emotional mapping in a way, because what happens is that as we get each text, each notification, it kind of gives us a sense of you know, interest and excitement, but then also, you know, perhaps also disappointment, and this kind of creates this kind of need for affirmation. So it's like a kind of addictive cycle. And I did some performances there to do with emotions. You can see these kind of brain dartboards on the left, and rewards in the form of chocolate. There's Ai Weiwei on the right. He designed the space that the gallery was in. The last quadrant is the environmental, and notice how I spell environmental on 2 lines. I think everything is ultimately a mental issue, and the environmental crisis is, from my perspective, is a mental issue, how we're kind of separated from the landscape around us because of our separation from ourselves, which is an inductive separation from ourselves. We don't communicate properly with ourselves. It's also a sensory breakdown, that we're not sensitized to what's around us. We've kind of cut ourselves off. And there's also a kind of social cutoff as well that's happened. And all those 3 things kind of lead to this environmental issue and project difficulty. So I did this project 10 years ago, which was kind of basically attacked by climate denialists, which was interesting. It was one of the first one of these kind of mass attacks that happened. But what happened was that I was working with these researchers who were tracking the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere and how they were going out of control. This was in 2009, and their emails were hacked and then cherry picked, and some certain phrases were released to make them seem like the data was wrong. Of course, 10 years later, we realized that unfortunately it was right. Anyway, the idea was to set up some sensors around the UK to become more aware of what the carbon dioxide levels were at the time. Nowadays, luckily, there's some satellites up in the sky that measure this around the world, but at the time there was very, very few sensors that were sensing atmospheric carbon dioxide. And that was, I made this sculpture called See You Tomorrow, that was displayed on the facade of the Royal Academy in London. And the idea was to signal the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So it was a kind of way of art and science to come together to kind of hold each other's hands. There's often science and scientists are kind of, it's all about peer-reviewed journals that very few people read. And so the findings that they often kind of can't communicate. So the idea of joining with artists is a way that they can kind of, project their findings and fears and suggestions. There's quite a big piece. On the left, there's this media artist, Alessandro Mariana Antoni, who I partnered on the project with. This is this is a project that Daniela probably recognizes. We worked on this in Cagliari a few years ago, and what we were doing was working with 30 engineering students to kind of map a city from different perspectives. We divided the city into 6 different parts, such as public spaces and public parks and private spaces. And then we asked the students to listen to this kind of hypnotic induction, and then based on that, we asked them to do some kind of sketches and some impressions. We gave them a questionnaire, and based on the questionnaire, then we could kind of map the kind of emotional impact of the different spaces and see, you know, the benefits and or otherwise of different places around the city. So what we wanted to do, which you can see on the right, we built this kind of robotic map that raised and lowered itself depending on people's emotional states in different parts of the city. So if a part of the city was considered to be like depressing or you know, kind of relating to you know, not so great memories, the map would deform downwards. Whereas if it was a place of excitement or happiness, the map would extrude upwards. Again, kind of showing how space, you know, we often think of flat floors, but floors themselves can, you know, a bit like the ramps I talked about, they can kind of have some kind of emotive language in them. And this was in Liverpool and in Athens. Again, it's kind of quite similar to the project in Cagliari of kind of using newer technologies to map kind of emotive relationships to different spaces around the city and tracking them. And then this is kind of the relationship between humans and animals. There were these kind of automatic drawings that were made through tracking my heartbeat in relationship to working with these animals, and mostly reptiles, because I was interested in something that was quite different from, you know, we're all used to, you know, cats and dogs and mammals seem very familiar, but I was interested in this, you know, what kind of emotive relationship we have with other creatures and how over time you could train yourself to have a kind of a more fluid and closer relationship to these other species. I suppose with the idea that over time one would be more benevolent to the world around us. This is from UC Berkeley. I worked with these kind of extinct species, passenger pigeons, which there was about 3 billion of them, billion with a B, 200 years ago, 150 years ago, and then they were all killed by humans. Except now there's about 10 or 15 of these birds that are preserved. And so the university is working to de-extinct them through genetic processes. And so I worked with them and this virtual reality project. This was a project in La Monnaie in Paris. This is an interesting building because it is at this site for more than 1,000, actually 1,200 years, has been continually creating coins for the French people. And so it's kind of been a continually running space, a kind of continually a social space with money that makes money, that creates, basically that has led to the kind of creation of the, you know, industry and, you know, the kind of, I suppose in the end, to like a lot of destruction of the planet, to be honest. So this project was about water security, and I worked with 8 different leading scientists, Nobel Prize winners, to develop some phrases to do with you know, how we should relate ourselves to water. And so it was a place that people could come and contemplate about water security and all the issues relating to that. And I also did a performance. I often like to do these kind of hypnotic performances because it puts people in a meditative state where they have the distance to be able to reassess their relationship to things such as water. Otherwise it's business as usual and nobody really understands anything and keeps going about their business, which might not be optimal. And then I'm almost finished here, and we'll have a little bit of Q&A time. This is a project to do with oil rigs and sea level rise. I had this idea of bringing an oil rig to some of the islands that are going underwater in the South Pacific, such as Tuvalu and Kiribati. And I wanted to drag an oil rig there so that they could preserve their nationhood. Because otherwise, once the land goes underwater, they lose not just their nation, but also a lot of other things, such as the 200-mile radius around them and other terrible things. That project has kind of evolved into one of studying the decommissioning of the oil rigs around California. And I'm working with the Orange County Museum of Art and the Getty Museum, and hopefully with James Cameron and indigenous tribal leaders in the area to create a kind of cultural center, and also a way of exploring the water underneath these rigs, some of which are so high. They're as high as the Empire State Building in New York. So they're massive structures. And they're also very, they've created a lot of ecological chaos, but now they're being tapped, and the base is an incredible place of ecological abundance, actually. And I think we're running out of time, but I just wanted to give one example of how these thoughts, the inductive, the sensory, the social, and the environmental fit into a given space. This is a project I'm working on. It's called Center for Centering. And the idea is for it to be a space that incorporates these 4 different aspects. So this would be in the inductive space where you can, sorry, the inductive space where you can lie down and sense the kind of internal space within. And then this would be the sensory space where there are these kind of encounters with objects, such as this would be a gong or sonic objects, or anything to do with touch or smell or sound. And then the environmental aspect, which would be this kind of labyrinth that connects you back out to nature. And then the dome itself would be the social space where people gather. And I'm just in the middle of working on a prototype right now, where we're building a scale prototype that we're going to show and share soon in June at a botanical gardens in Los Angeles called Descanso Gardens. And so here's the kind of work in progress of that space. And the idea is that it's a kind of transitional project, so that we will be able to build the full scale project that will be shared in some beautiful place, hopefully. And then just to finish up, as Rosaura mentioned, I've been working with this COVID issue. I've been working with the community and making these roses, felt roses. This is at the LA Convention Center that the mayor opened up the project. And you know, unfortunately, there have been almost 1 million deaths of COVID in the United States, and 7 million around the world. And so this is a kind of issue of our times. I think, again, you know, you see this architectural space and you think, okay, so from an architect's point of view, it's like it's a space of geometry, but really there's also this dimension of emotion. So that's something to be thought about. And just to finish up, I'm working on a national COVID memorial project to make memorials all around the United States and possibly elsewhere that incorporate this kind of release and relief and celebration also of people's lives. And I've been working with this nonprofit called Marked by COVID. And so we're working on this this project right now. We've got support from several lawmakers around the country, and it involves some augmented reality and some static objects, in this case a plinth, basically. So that's about what I wanted to share. So maybe, I know it's been a lot of things, but I'd like to kind of turn it over to some questions if anybody has any.
Yeah, thank you for that amazing presentation. It looks like the first question and comment is from Daniela. Daniela, did you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Marcos. It's always a pleasure for me to hear about your project and your work. Marcos is a very dear friend of mine for more than 20 years when I was a student. And I learned about space. From myself, I learned a lot from him about how we can perceive space and express this perception. So, Marcos, in your work, space is always been connected with perception, sensation, emotions. But in the last 2 years with the pandemic, do you think that anything is changed about how we perceive space as human beings? And so maybe we are we more conscient about the space, or about private spaces, for example? Or do you think there are big changes in this relationship between human and space? That's my question.
I think definitely there has to be changes. For instance, I remember I used to kind of study ergonomics, which was again kind of like the space around things that were kind of recommended in architecture, like the space, you know, for a chair around a desk, or for, you know, the kind of social space you needed, you know, for a hallway or something like that. I think with this kind of COVID time, the whole kind of science of ergonomics has changed. It may kind of go back to how it was before, but I think, you know, there's this kind of I suppose, coughing. I had COVID twice actually, but this kind of paranoia, slight paranoia of people being in the same space, individuals being close, but then also being in a space with a lot of people. So I suppose there's this kind of unconscious or conscious desire to have more space. I guess that could impact how people, you know, might design buildings. You know, maybe unconsciously, maybe they'll try to create more space. And then I suppose, I don't know, I guess there's the emotive aspect too, this kind of emotion that people have been through. There's a lot of medical, psychological trauma that's come out of this. So, you know, when people design, I would imagine that they would be more wary of, you know, creating spaces that are hostile. You know, like what I was saying about the kiki buba, you know, not creating too much kiki and thinking about buba. And buba could be, you know, in terms of the colors chosen, you know, so harmonious colors, or, you know, spaces that aren't too echoey. I guess it's kind of open for discussion, but yeah, it's a good question.
Thank you, Marcos.
Thank you. It looks like Bill has the next question. So Bill, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, no, thanks, and thank you for that very rich talk there, Marcos. So it was a lot of stuff, and really some really beautiful stuff as well. I've got a question about this idea of synesthesia, and what you mentioned was the you know, it's the conventional wisdom that it's a condition that some people have. You know, it's kind of like a disorder of sorts. It's almost got that kind of connotation to it. But what I'm wondering is whether we don't all have a bit of synesthesia in us, otherwise known as metaphor, you know, otherwise known as association, sometimes quite lateral association, and to what extent the materiality of our senses also tracks emotion. There you go. There's a hard question, perhaps.
Yeah. I suppose metaphor is more kind of cerebral, let's say, whereas synesthesia would be more kind of involuntary and embodied. But the kind of the thought is that we're all synesthetes when we're, you know, 4 or 5 years old, and then what happens is that there's a kind of certain pruning in the brain where these kind of different sensory and cognitive aspects are kind of blocked off from each other. But what I have discovered through hypnosis is that people can kind of tap into their kind of innate synesthesia. So I would agree that we're all synesthetes. We just kind of forgot. And I think that's something that could be recovered. And by recovering it, we regain our kind of sensitivity. And from that, our dealings with other people and the environment and all these things would improve.
Thank you. It looks like Rosara has a comment. I don't know, Rosara, if you wanted to unmute yourself and say your comment or.
Thank you, Elizabeth. No, just to say also thank you to Marcus, because it's also a really nice catch up to a lot of things that you have been doing in the last years that we just saw you here in Monterrey. And I wanted to also share that I was part of one of these workshops that you did with our students. I was able and had the lucky to be part of it and participate. And it really, as I recall, and I have pictures and I still remember from time to time what I have experienced myself and what in deep of my mind that I was able to get with your guidance. But also it was not only the reflection that we were able to make during that workshop, and that if I make like an analysis right now, I guess it will be completely different what I will get from these insights inside of my mind and my heart, especially after COVID, as well as being sick and having family and close people suffering this disease. I guess it will have different results and different outcomes from this like reflection, and also how that deep reflections that you help us to obtain can also change the way we now see architecture or we now see design, or hopefully that helps to us to a new perspective, more profound or more sensitive about how we feel the space and how we need to be designing. So I just wanted to say this comment, but I recall that moment to a really, really special moment of reflection as designers, that we have to continue practicing and taking the time to make that reflection. So I just wanted to remember that moment, and I'm really thankful for that, Marcus. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Actually, I didn't really touch too much on that, but I work a lot with workshops. Next week I'm going to be in Torino in Italy, running some kind of workshops and programs to do with proto-languages and sensitivity. And I think that's, I suppose as an artist, I'm mostly interested in kind of like a transmission of ideas and approaches, as opposed to kind of a creator of objects that are bought and sold. So, you know, I think that's hearing from you, you know, what that workshop kind of gave to you and that you still retain is, you know, makes me feel very happy and makes me feel that it's worthwhile.
Yes.
Thank you. And it looks like we're coming to the end of the hour. Kayla posted the link for the discussion board for Marco's schedule element. So if you have any other comments or questions, feel free to continue the discussion there. This recording will be uploaded a little later this morning, so you'll be able to go back and rewatch it and continue to ask questions. And then coming up in about 30 minutes, we have a plenary session with Viviano Buron at 10:30. Kayla also posted the link for that. And thank you again, Marcos, for that amazing presentation. And thank you for everyone to coming. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference and the sessions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.